Hello, my name is Christian Stiglmayr from Berlin in Germany, and I'm proud to tell you something about DBT for clients with an emotion regulation disorder, especially clients with a borderline personality disorder. In the following hour, I will give you some information about the development of DBT, how DBT works, emotion work in DBT, self-compassion in DBT, efficacy of DBT, and I will close with a short summary. Here you can see the founder of DBT, Professor Marsha Linehan. She's born in Oklahoma, and now she is living in Seattle. DBT is empirically generated from Marsha Linehan in the late 70s, beginning of 80s. DBT is a procedure of the third wave of behavioral therapy. And DBT has a modular structure. This means that different modules can be used depending on the focus of the disorder. The therapeutic focus in DBT is a treatment of an emotion regulation disorder. That means that DBT is a therapy that focuses on emotions the whole time. How DBT works. The overarching goal in DBT is to build functional strategies for emotion regulation with the goal of benevolent acceptance of oneself. So psychotherapy in DBT means that DBT is a journey to yourself through the eye of the needle of emotions. So if the client wants to come in touch with himself, he has to get in touch with the whole range of his emotions. Now, the procedure in DBT is that on the one hand, you block dysfunctional behavior patterns, for example, self-injurious behavior, inappropriate anger outbursts, while simultaneously you promote functional behavior patterns by teaching skills, for example, stress tolerance skills, emotion regulation skills, based on an authentic and resilient relationship. Now I will inform you about the characteristics of DBT. The D in the term of DBT stands for dialectics. That means there's balance between acceptance and change. The B stands for behavioral. That means there is a behavioral therapy basis. And additional, DBT has an integrative approach, a clear structure and hierarchy, and finally, you are always aware about your own boundaries. And if they are touched, you inform the client immediately. So as a therapist, you are responsible for your own well-being within psychotherapy to be the best therapist you can be. So let's focus on what dialectic really means in DBT. To this end, I would like to show you a video in which Marsha Linehan explains how she came to develop DBT.
I started working with highly suicidal people. As it turned out, the people met criteria for borderline personality disorder, but A, I had never heard of borderline personality disorder, and B, I didn't know what it was. Even if you told me the name, I wouldn't have known. So that was the beginning of the whole thing. I had no idea what I was doing, except that I was studying suicide. What happened was standard behavior therapy of the 1970s and early 1980 blew up. And the main reason it did is because what it requires for it to work is for a person to come in and you be able to say, okay, here's the problem, and here's what we'll do to change it. And for the person to say, okay, I'll try that. But the people I was dealing with immediately said, you're saying I'm the problem. And so they were so sensitive to any invalidation or statement that they were the problem that the treatment blew up. And they would either get angry at me, hide behind a chair, storm out, quit therapy, yell and scream, cry, or say they're going to kill themselves. So it didn't take me too long to figure out this was not going to work out. So I thought, okay, we're going to switch to a more acceptance-based treatment. So I'm going to validate and be very accepting. So I tried that. That blew up also, because then the patient said, you mean you're not going to help me? You're just going to listen to me? Most of the patients I treat have already been through a whole lot of therapy where you talk, get listened to, and understood. The problem is talking, being listened to, and being understood doesn't necessarily make anything change. So then they got really upset with me because I wasn't helping them change. So that's when I realized that I had to pull together major emphasis on change with a technology of acceptance. So I had a technology of change, now I needed a technology of acceptance. The technology of acceptance primarily was validation. So it's behavior therapy with a huge amount of validation. So problem solving, validation are the core components of the treatment.
So how Marshall Linehan explained, the main dialectic in DBT is acceptance and change. So I would like to explain to you what dialectics mean in relationships, so between the therapist and the client. So at the bottom of this slide, you see a titter-tatter. And on the titter-tatter, you see on the left the client and on the right the therapist. So let's imagine the following therapeutical situation. You as a therapist would like to get a non-suicide commitment from your client for 1 year. But the client immediately rejects such a commitment. On the titter-tatter of relationship, the client takes a step back from the therapist by such a reaction. Quite often, our first reaction as a therapist is to run after the client. But what happens with the titter-tatter? Exactly. It loses its balance. Therefore, running after the client is not good DBT. Good DBT would be when the client goes back, that you as a therapist also go back. So you always tried to find a good balance between you and the client. But that doesn't mean that when the client says no, you shouldn't just say no also. That wouldn't work. So there are two persons, one says no and the other says no as well. Then happens nothing. There's no more movement. And one of the most important things in therapy is movement. Good DBT is that you try to find a good balance and additionally to bring movement in the life of the client by getting their non-suicide commitment. So you're always wandering on this titter-tatter. You can ask the client, for example, if the client says, no, I won't, I don't, you don't get my commitment. So you can ask the client, okay, that's bad. So maybe we can't work together because I need this commitment. But are you interested in my personal opinion? And maybe the client says, yeah. What you would like to say to me? So you can tell them, okay, unfortunately we can't work if I don't get your commitment, but on the other side, I really would like to work together with you. And I'm absolutely convinced that you really can benefit greatly from DBT. But it's your decision. So there's a lot of movement by offering a good relationship. I really would like to work with you. But on the other hand, I need a strong commitment from you that we can work together. Okay? So it's a little bit similar to this picture. Yeah, where you can find these two guys who are trying to find a balance, but in the same time, they are still moving. Okay. Next, let's focus on the term behavioral. The working tool of DBT is a behavioral analysis. And within this behavioral analysis, you try to find out what triggers the behavior. That's a classic conditioning. And what maintains the behavior. So that's operant conditioning. To help the client to modify his behavior, you use contingency management. And contingency management refers to a strategy that seeks to change behavior by modifying its consequences. For example, whenever the client manages to go a month without hurting himself, you offer an extra therapy session. Or the other way around, whenever the client hurts himself, one therapy session is cancelled or will be short. That would be contingency management. But what is very important, you always discuss the contingency management before, together with the client. So a DBT therapist always reinforces functional behavior through the relationship, but never reinforces dysfunctional behavior through the relationship. So next, let's have a look what an integrative approach really means. And the following approaches can be found represented in DBT. That's the behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy, conversational psychotherapy, gestalt therapy, self-compassion techniques, and there's a lot of Zen Buddhism and mindfulness. Marshall Linehan is a Zen master, but not a Buddhist. And therefore, the perspective of Zen has highly influenced DBT. Let's take a look at what clear structure means in DBT. The most important structure and strategy within DBT is that you always focus on emotions. That means that every time an emotion comes up, you make it a topic of focus. There are 4 treatment stages which are structuring the DBT as a whole. And you see these 4 stages at the bottom of the slide. And the goal of stage 0 is orientation and motivation. Within this stage, you are not in therapy. You try to get a commitment for therapy for DBT. In stage 1, you already have a commitment for therapy. And in stage 1, the goal of stage 1 is the improvement of behavior control. That means that we block avoidance behaviors like self-interest behavior, suicidal behavior, drinking alcohol, etc., to get in contact to the emotions of the client. So if we have blocked the avoidance behavior, the emotions are present. And then we start in stage 2, where we can work with the emotions who were blocked before by dysfunctional behavior. Though the goal of stage 2 is the improvement of emotion regulation by acceptance of the emotions. Stage 3 has the goal of making life worth living. Within all these stages, there is a dynamic hierarchy. First of all, you focus on life-threatening behavior. That means whenever behavior occurs that could be dangerous for the client's life, you will focus on that behavior in the therapy session via a behavioral analysis and nothing else. That's the topic for this session. If no life-threatening behavior is present, the next step is to look for behaviors that could lead to an early end of psychotherapy. And if this behavior is also not present, you have a focus on severe crises, like, for example, self-interest behavior, drinking alcohol, promiscuitive behavior, etc. And if this behavior is also not present, behavior that jeopardizes therapy progress is the next topic. And if none of these behaviors are present, you are free to discuss what you and the client consider as important. So you also can have another focus on the stages. It's a very interesting focus, a focus on the development of the client's identity. And the first focus, the first stage, it's stage 0, there's a focus like, who am I? The borderline persons ask quite often, who am I? I don't know what's going on. Who am I? Stage 1 is, I'm a borderline client. So there's a high identification being a borderline client. In stage 2 is, I'm borderline and so much more. So they start to get rid of this stigmatization of being borderline patient client. And stage 3 mean, I'm strange, but great. And the next slide shows you what exactly that means. That means this stage 3. Maybe I you know, these Japanese bowls, and if there are cracks within these bowls, they are filled with gold, and they get very valuable and very expensive. And maybe that's a metaphor. For example, the goal of DBT, when even through the cracks, even when the cracks can be very painful, they also have the potential to create something very valuable. So that's the goal we want to reach together with the client. So let's have a look what emotion work is in DBT. What exactly means emotion work in DBT? From a client's perspective, emotions are rejected because they are perceived as uncontrollable, not experienced as appropriate. Mother always said that your feelings are wrong, for example, and they are quite often very painful. So what happens when you don't want an emotion to be true or accepted? First of all, emotions get stronger. For example, fear turns into panic. Maybe someone of you have already experienced exactly this. And emotions can come to light in other inappropriate places. That also can happen. For example, the anger towards the partner breaks out somewhere else. And finally, emotions must be regulated in a different way. So most clients use dysfunctional strategies to regulate emotions, for example, suicidal behavior, self-interest behavior, alcohol, drugs, high-risk behavior, binge eating, starving, etc. Conclusion. Rejecting one's own emotions cause a lot of problems. And because emotions are the basis for identity, rejection one's own emotions means nothing else than rejecting oneself. And a significant part of life energy is used to reject emotions and thus oneself. The result is there's a lot of suffering. Now, how are emotions dealt with in DBT? In general, with increasing therapy duration, the proportion of emotion activation and thus emotion exposure becomes more extensive. So in stage 2, there's more emotion activation than in stage 1, and in stage 3 is more emotion activation and exposure than in stage 2. The first thing to do is to clear the way to the primary emotion. That's the goal of stage 1. To reach this goal, you have to block dysfunctional behavior which the client has used so far for emotion regulation. To be able to block dysfunctional behavior, the clients need crisis survival skills as, for example, using cold water, tightening and relaxing different muscles of the body, standing on a wobbly surface with one leg, eating chili, drinking lemon juice, a little bit softer than eating chili, using ammonia inhalant, breathing, especially exhaling, the skill I love very much, and distracting activities like, for example, playing computer games or doing housework, etc. This slide shows you a skills chain. And the chain starts with a very effective crisis survival skill, like, for example, ammonia inhalant. Then next, the client could use, for example, cold water. That's the skill number 2. Then he could call his therapist. That's the skill number 3. And finally, he uses an emotion regulation skill. So the goal is to handle the emotion which is responsible for the increase of aversive tension. So it's not necessary that the client only uses crisis survival skill. He always has to use an emotion regulation skill as well. So there are 3 focuses in emotion work. The first focus is perceive and mark. That means whenever an emotion is perceptible or noticeable, it is addressed. The second focus is describe. That means perceiving and describing the emotion. If you name it, you tame it. So there comes up a distance to the emotion. And the third focus is participate. That means experiencing the primary emotion. If you feel it, you heal it. That's exactly what we do when we do trauma therapy. So the message from the therapist to the client when he is doing emotion work is, I trust you to endure such emotions. The primary emotion is appropriate. I'm there for you and accompany you even in your most emotionally difficult hours. And you are welcome with your emotions. That's my message to the client. And the target behavior of the client I want to reach together with him by doing this emotion work is be a poor, polite host who opens the door right when there's a knock at the door. Ah, it's you, welcome. And crying and sobbing, you have brought too. Come in and sit down by the fireplace and tell me all about it. But what happens now when you let in a previously avoided, mostly unpleasant emotion? Right, there comes up a lot of pain. It really hurts you. How can this pain be dealt with? The most effective way to deal with this kind of pain is the practice of self-compassion. There are 3 main pillars of self-compassion. The first one is mindfulness. That means in order to respond to our need, we must know that we are suffering right now. The second pillar is self-friendliness. That means to treat oneself with kindness, care, and understanding. And the third pillar is common humanity. That means everyone suffers or makes the experience of not being perfect. So we are not alone with our pain. So to summarize, self-compassion is a state of loving, connected presence. And what is very important, we practice self-compassion not so much with the goal of feeling better, but because we feel bad. But take care. We open the door of our hearts and the fresh air of self-compassion flows in. Old pain and fears likely to come out. That was mentioned from Christian Neff and Chris Germer, who are the founders of Mindful Self-Compassion. So at the very beginning of the practice of self-compassion, there may even be an aggravation for a while. But it's your job as a therapist to make sure that the aggravation doesn't get too big. And therefore, there are some requirements before you start to teach self-compassion. I recommend that there's no more severe dysfunctional behavior like deep cuts, for example. The client should be able to use distress tolerance skills if there's too much stress. He should be able to regulate his emotions. He should be able to use mindfulness skills to detect pain if there's pain. And he should have a minimum of 1, better 2 stable social relationships he can contact if there is stress. So now I would like to introduce you to a basic exercise that I use quite frequently in DBT. First, you have to recognize that this is a moment of suffering. For this, it can be helpful to localize emotional pain in the body. Most clients say pain is right here in the breast. In the sense of common humanity, suffering is part of life. That means that I'm not alone with my pain. And for this, it can be helpful to place a hand on this area you have detected right before. And this creates warmth and body contact. And finally, self-friendliness by benevolent coaxing. That means you could say to yourself, may I accept myself as I am? May I accept myself as I am? And that could become a routine that you do with a client whenever there is a painful moment, a painful, unpleasant emotion. So let's focus on a special topic within the psychotherapy with borderline patients, and that's the emotion shame. That's a very unpleasant emotion that most clients experience quite often. So to understand why this immersion is so important for these clients, we have to understand the function of shame. And one of the most basic needs in childhood is to be loved, especially in childhood, but also in adulthood, is to be loved and to belong. But unfortunately, most of our clients have had the experience of not being loved and belonging. And if they don't get as much love as they need, the thought comes up, I'm wrong the way I am. Otherwise, I would be loved. Therefore, I'm different from others. And this is existential shame. I'm different from others. Alienation. The result of this unfulfilled need is a permanent search for love and belonging in the outside world. But unfortunately, in the adult world, unconditional love no longer exists. Therefore, the client has to accept that no one will be able to meet those needs that they, parents, normally should have done. And this causes a lot of pain. And therefore, a lot of self-compassion is needed to handle this pain, which may comes up right in this moment. So self-compassion is the antidote to shame. So let's start with a short look at the efficacy of DBT. And in a recent meta-analysis, including 24 randomized controlled trials, there were moderate to strong effect sizes with respect to self-interest behavior, suicidality, and mental health. By far, the most efficacy studies are available for DBT, followed by mentalization-based therapy with 7 studies. So there's a big difference concerning the numbers of randomized control studies. So based on the current studies, only DBT and MBT are recommended as evidence-based methods for the treatment of borderline personality disorder. We were interested about the effectiveness of outpatient DBT under normal supply conditions here in Berlin. And we have done a study from 2007 to 2010 and included 47 clients. Most of them were females, and they have got outpatient DBT for 1 year. And I don't want to take too much time for this slide, but the most important results are there is a significant reduction in self-interest behavior, as well in the number of inpatient days. And another very important result is that 77% of the clients no longer fulfilled the borderline diagnosis after 1 year of DBT. I think that's a quite impressive result. Another result we have got from our study is that the costs that there's a significant reduction of the costs clients causes within the welfare system. So outpatient DBT reduces costs to nearly half. That means that every euro invested in DBT saves 2 euros. Okay, let's close with a short summary. DBT is an empirically generated psychotherapeutic method of the third wave of behavior therapy. DBT is an emotion-focusing therapy, and in order to be able to work with the client's emotions, the first thing to do is to put an end to previously dysfunctional behaviors for emotion regulation, and the whole rest of therapy, you focus on the emotions of that client. Mindfulness and self-compassion are necessary components for treating clients with BPD, and DBT is effective for treating clients with borderline personality disorder and clients with an emotion regulation disorder. Thank you very much for your attention.